Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Cool Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Over the years, I've come to see the editor as the MVP of film and TV shows. Without their careful attention to pacing, plotting, graphics, sound, and more, the project simply falls apart. But when the editor is good, the end result is seamless, so much so that we don't even realize there's an editor who made it that way. If there's a secret to good editing, maybe Michael Kahn, the legendary nonagenarian editor known for his collaborations with Steven Spielberg, has figured it out. It's not about knowledge, he says. It's all about feeling or intuition. Good editors, what makes them special is that they feel things. Your feeling is what you're getting paid for. Documentaries and docuseries pose particular challenges for editors who must juggle and manipulate interview and archival footage, still photos, sound clips, establishing shots, and so on. But really, what do I know? I'm not a film editor, but our guest is.
We're happy to have with us longtime film editor Gary Pollak, whose credits include the Netflix docuseries Last Chance U Football, Last Chance U Basketball, and the brand new Gunther's Millions about a dog with a trust fund and a wacky handler. Gary, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Would you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what inspired you to become an editor?
Well, I grew up in New York, as you can tell from the hat, even though I don't live there anymore. What inspired me? Well, to tell you the truth, I sort of landed in it. It's not something I went to school for. I went to school for writing, which I actually use in editing all the time because writing and editing are very tied together. I moved out here. I knew I wanted to do something in television or film, and I was just working at a company that did live corporate events, and one day they bought an edit system, and I sort of sat down and noodled with it, and it was like just a natural fit, and I was good at it, and I like the tech part because I'm a tech head, and I'm an introvert, which is good because I got to sit in a room by myself and sort of taught myself it, and then did that for about 5 years doing corporate events, and then worked my way into television from there.
I know you've been in the business for a while. You've probably seen a lot of technological changes over the years. Has it become easier or harder to get to know new systems and that kind of stuff?
Well, it's both. I mean, I started when I didn't start as far back as cutting film, although it was still done in those days, but not by me. But I did start in the tape days. Yeah, now they use computer nonlinear editing, meaning you can take any piece of footage and put it anywhere. And if you have a sequence that's 10 minutes long, you can put a shot right in the middle, just open it up. And I can tape editing to writing a novel on a typewriter versus on a word processor. When you're in tape, if you want to put something in the middle, you either have to re-edit everything after that point, or you have to copy the whole thing over to another tape, up to point B, and then insert the shot you want, and then take off the other tape. And you go down a generation every time you do that. So that was really hard. So while nonlinear editing gives you the freedom to do things, it's a double-edged sword because it gives you the freedom to do everything and it never stops. And you can just make 1,000 different versions of the same sequence, and you can be asked to do 1,000 different versions. And some producers would be like, show me 3 versions of that ending. Whereas that just wasn't, with tape, it was just not realistic.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you might be a perfectionist or trying to fight some of those tendencies. But I also read that you consider yourself a predator, and that's producer-editor, in case anyone is wondering. So what exactly does that term mean? I mean, it's amusing and kind of provocative.
A predator is basically really only anybody who works in this industry would know the term. It means that there are editors who just, you hand them a script and they'll edit it. A predator is somebody who more like gets involved in the guts of the story and figuring out what the story is and producing it. And you just give me a bunch of footage and I'll figure out what the story is, or I'll work on the best structure for it, as opposed to somebody who's just like, just tell me what you want it to look like and I'll do it. That's just like a straight editor.
We figure you probably put a lot more time into an episode or film than most of the people who work on it. Do you find yourself becoming an expert on the subjects that you're working on?
It sort of depends on what it is. I do a lot of crime shows, and not always what I want to be doing, but with crime shows, you have to do a lot of research because you have to really know what the story is. You want it to be journalistically accurate. Can't put words in people's mouths, so you have to really know what the story was. Other subjects are a little more freeform. Like, for instance, when I worked on Last Chance U, I know nothing about football. I can barely tell you the rules of football. And I told him this when I did the interview. As you know, Jonathan, I'm a baseball guy. I could tell you, I could talk for hours about baseball, but football, I barely know anything yet. I worked for 6 months on a football show, and the same thing with basketball, very little knowledge about it. But it doesn't really matter. I didn't need to be an expert, largely because I can cobble together enough to handle the games to make sure that the games make sense. And I'm not, although sometimes somebody will point out, hey, what you just did here is impossible, like in the rules. But since that show is mostly about the stories of the people, it didn't really matter. So it really depends what I'm working on, whether I have to research or not.
Depends on the project, right? You do work for hire primarily, so
yes,
you kind of don't get to choose if you're doing something on Ecuador, if you're doing something on the New York Mets.
Well, I get to choose in that. I turn down certain jobs that I just don't get to. There are certain crime shows now that I've reached the point where it's like I'm not going to do them anymore. And I just say now. I did one called Family Massacre, and that was sort of the breaking point for me, subject wise. Nothing against the show. A lot of great people on the show. The show turned out pretty well, but just not a kind of show I want to do anymore.
So Gunther's Millions, a 4-part docuseries that you've been working on recently. Mind sharing just a little bit about what it's about?
It's pretty strange. Gunther's Millions is about a dog that's inherited $400 million, but there's more to it than that. It's not just like, oh, look at this goofy story. There's a lot of different layers. Mainly I'm not giving a lot away here, but Gunther has a handler who is somewhat of a con man, and he's the main character of this. And he has sort of been manipulating this whole Gunther situation to his advantage for decades. And he's a little bit of he's a showman, he's an attention seeker, he likes to make money, and he manages to use this dog story of this countess, leading all his way to the dog that he's in charge of handling to do all these things to his advantage. It's pretty convoluted, and it goes places you wouldn't expect it to go.
Man, that's a crazy story. It also seems like a very complex story to tell. Maybe you could take us through the process of editing a show like that.
Well, in a show like that, it kind of shows the difference between like a scripted and a documentary show. Some shows, like crime shows, have a more linear path. Like you can maybe tell the story in a different order, but you've still got to tell an A to Z story. A show like Gunther's, you can basically tell the story in any order you want, which makes it really hard because there's no right answer to it. And everybody has their own opinion. I'll have an opinion. The story producer has an opinion. The directors have an opinion. The owner of the company has an opinion. And then ultimately Netflix has an opinion. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a push-pull with those elements to try to get the story to feel right. And sometimes you get sort of a mishmash between things, and you get the sense that everybody has had their hands in the pie and everybody has an opinion on it. So a show like Gunther's was very, like, the structure kept getting changed around. I was originally supposed to be the main editor on episode 3, and I cut episode 3, and Netflix decided, the first half of this should be the end of episode 2, and then episode 2, the second half should be the beginning of 3. So the whole structure of the show changed order several times. When you see a show, it kind of feels like that's the only way it ever could have been. I'm stealing that line from another editor I worked with, it was a great line. It seems like it could only ever have been done that way, but it's actually gone through hundreds of different iterations to get to the point where it's at.
Yeah, and that story, I mean, the complexity of it, I think, is partially so much happens in the story. It's a confusing story, I think, to begin with. And then you have all of these different people involved in terms of interviews and old footage and that really weird stuff with the dog recording, the music starring the dogs barking. Joey, you might be interested in that. It's like the worst thing I've ever heard. But it seems like such a monumental task. And I know a lot of that would fall on the editor.
Yeah, that show had 4 editors, 4 primary editors. Later in the game, a few of us swapped out, because one of the things about working freelance is sometimes the show runs long and you've got another job already. So I had to leave at a certain point and another editor stepped in and helped finish it up. But it was primarily 4 of us. And you have to collaborate a lot to make sure that all the pieces make sense, that you're not doing the same thing in episode 3 that you did in episode 1. And
we figure actors look up to other actors and directors looking up to other directors. Are there editors whose work has influenced yours and what makes them so special?
Nobody that you would have ever heard of, just mostly colleagues. In narrative film, you have editors like Barn Scorsese uses Thomas Schoonmaker. But in docs, yes, well-known doc directors have their own people that they use. But for the most part, I'll work with somebody and I'm like, that person's really good. And I'll usually steal some technique that I really like. I'll just absorb it into my own toolkit. So there are editors I've worked with that I really think are great and I look up to, but nobody of name that I could name that would mean anything.
Well, you could certainly shout out some colleagues if you want.
I don't think I want to, because then the ones that I forget will be insulted. I don't want to go down that. There's too many to name, and there's so many people I've worked with over the years that are great that I don't want to slight somebody by not mentioning them.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. Well, and kind of along those same lines, being an editor probably makes you more sensitive to bad editing when you see it. And, without naming anything in particular, any project, any film or anything, how do you react when you see something that's poorly edited?
What's poorly edited can be hard to say. You might not notice the things that I notice. It can be, I think you also have to be able to differentiate what's bad material from what's bad editing. And sometimes you can really elevate mediocre material and you can say that's really well edited, that really moved along, or use of music or something that elevated it. What's bad is usually poor pacing, shots that are held too long. In editing, you'd be surprised what a difference being 2 frames off on every edit can be. I'll often look at something like this just isn't working, and I'll trim it 2 frames here, 1 frame here, 3 frames there, and suddenly it just works. So it's kind of a fine line of what makes it good and what makes it bad. I can tell you some things that editors notice that the average viewer might notice but not realize what it is. There's something called frankenbiting, which is, every editor knows this. It's where you take different words and put them together. And it can be a matter of shortening up a sentence, or it can be taking this sentence from here and this sentence from there. And in extreme situations, it's replacing words or stringing together words. And every show has its own level. Usually for me, it's as long as I'm not changing the meaning of what they're saying, I'm just clarifying it or making it cleaner, it's okay. Some shows, they wholesale invent things, which I'm against. But bad frankenbiting, you can just hear it. It's terrible. Someone will say, I drove my car to the store. It sounds bad, or words are overlapping slightly. It can be really hard to do. And bad editing, you'll hear the frankenbites.
Yeah, I think there must be a visual sort of parallel, because in some things I've seen, you'll have someone drinking a glass of water, and then there'll be another shot at a different angle, and they're kind of bringing the water up to their mouth again, like a slight, right, delay, and they're kind of doing it twice.
Well, that's continuity.
Yeah.
And that's something that I definitely, some people have an eye for it anyway, but I definitely noticed that. You can't watch a movie where somebody's smoking a cigarette and it's going to match. the next shot because there's just no way to do multiple takes and make the cigarettes match every time. But there's lots of other things in continuity that clothes change all the time. And I'm always an advocate that if you're involved in the story, you won't notice it, but you'd be surprised how often somebody walks out of one frame and into the next frame and their clothes are different.
Yeah. Are you sort of compassionate about some of that stuff? Just knowing how difficult it is to do that continuity?
Yeah. It's sometimes it's just impossible. Sometimes it's a matter of, if I can't get continuity, I'll at least try to get cut on somebody with their hand is moving so that when their hand is moving to the next shot, even if it's the wrong hand, your eye just kind of sees oh, there is movement. But if you start with somebody with their hand down and the next shot it's up in the air, you're going to see that. But if they're just in movement, you're less likely to catch it. I always bring up my favorite story of continuity is the 80s movie Jagged Edge, Glenn Close, and what's his name for the Big Lebowski?
Jeff Bridges?
Yes, Jeff Bridges, yeah. So it was a mystery thriller, and the end trial was supposed to take place over 4 days. And in editing, they decided to make it one courtroom scene, and their clothes changed drastically during the courtroom scene. It's like Glenn Close is wearing a polka dot dress, and then the next shot she's wearing stripes, and the ties were all changing. And it's kind of, the days before everybody was renting and streaming, so you have to go to the theater multiple times to catch it. But that's to me, that's the example I always bring up of people, if you're involved in the story, you don't notice some of those things.
I got to see that.
And of course, then there's always just mistakes, which is my favorite story is that I worked on the show. When you do a show, it goes through many layers of checking. The editor submits it, the online editor checks it, the executive producer watches it, and it goes to network, and they do what's called a QC, quality control. And if there's any mistakes, you have to fix them before it airs. I worked on the show and had a shot that aired upside down.
Avant-garde.
It was a shot of a city. It was it started on a horizontal panel wall, like a brick wall, and then the brick wall gives way, and then there's a city, and it's upside down.
That sounds far out.
They went through a lot of people who didn't catch that.
I guess this is a kind of a funny question, but your surname is Pollak, and you also kind of look like the actor Kevin Pollak. The two of you work in the same business broadly. Have you ever been mistaken for him, or maybe for his brother?
There's only one instance where it's possible, and I don't know for sure, but I was once at a bar, and I gave my credit card to put on the tab, and I was sitting with my friend with a couple drinks, and then when I went back to sign the tab, the bartender was like, "Really nice to meet you," and shook my hand, and I was like, "Why is he shaking my hand?" I was like, "Oh, nice to meet you too." And then later on, I was like, "I bet he thinks I was Kevin Pollak."
Personally, I get Zach Braff a lot, and I thought wearing glasses and having a mustache would stop that, but I guess there's some pictures of him floating around with a mustache too, so I can't escape it. So I guess one logical question to ask would be, of all the projects you've worked on, do you have a favorite, and why?
There's different level of favorites. There's favorites because I'm proud of it because I think it turned out great. There's favorites because it was the most fun thing to work on, but not necessarily the best show. And then there's favorites because I know that I made something that was basically made out of spit, and it actually came out okay. And I know what went into it, that we made something out of nothing. So it's kind of hard. It's a hard question to answer. I think proudest of would probably be, I spent a lot of years working on Lockup. And that was sort of where I had done docuseries before that, but that's really where I cut my teeth in doing some serious stuff. And that's an important show to me because I really do believe that people want to just lock people up and throw away the key and not even know their stories. And I think the stories are important to be told. So that's a show I'm really proud of. And I think Last Chance U also. I think Last Chance U, a lot of shows will play games with things that happen and play fast and loose with the facts. And both Lockup and Last Chance U are really accurate and strive to not play those kind of games. And what you're seeing is really a pretty accurate representation. I mean, yes, you have to remove things. You can't show everything. And Lockup, you'd have 3 stories an episode, and you'd have to cut out, a really complicated court case. You'd have to really streamline it to make it anybody be able to follow it and fit it into that space. So yes, you're removing things, but you're not inventing things. You're not changing things. You're not making people say things they didn't mean. And you're telling a true story, and you're really trying to be truthful to what the person was like.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, for sharing all your insights. And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.